Let's continue working on our post show component. Now, in the last section, we did say that it seems like this component was going to be pretty easy to put together. And yeah, that is true. There's not going to be a lot of code here, but there is one very important aspect or concept that is kind of underlying the creation of this component right here. So let's figure out exactly what that is. So it all comes down to how we load our data inside of our application. Really quick, I want you to just imagine that a user comes to our application by navigating directly to the root route, so the post index component. If the user visits the post index component first inside of our application, it'll call that action creator that we made much earlier to fetch our big list of posts. So that action creator will go and fetch all of our different posts from the backend API, and we would eventually end up with a post piece of application state that contains maybe post 1, 2, and 3. So all the different posts we have. Now I want you to imagine a different thing that might occur inside of our application, a different flow. I want you to imagine that the user opens up their browser and manually navigates over to the post show component by presumably going to localhost 8080/post/5. So maybe they, or 2, let's stick with 2. So maybe they want to see the post with an ID of 2. Now, in an ideal world, whenever a user wants to look at a very particular post, we're not going to go and fetch the big list of posts again. We're only going to fetch the very specific post that a user wants to see. So post 2. So if a user goes directly to the post show component, we want to only fetch the data that is required. But if a user lands on our application by going to the post index page, we want to fetch everything that's available. It's really important to keep in mind that a user can enter into your application on pretty much absolutely any page that they want by either bookmarking the page, or maybe they open up a new tab, or maybe they share a link with a friend. You always have to assume that a user might be entering to any given page inside of your application. So what I'm really trying to say here is that the post show component really needs to be responsible for fetching its own data. We cannot assume that the user first went to the post index page and fetched the big list of posts and then navigated over to post show. We have to always assume that the user, or we need to fetch fresh data for the user whenever the user comes to this component. So with that in mind, let's start off this new component by putting together an action creator to go and fetch a very particular post. So I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and I'm inside of my post show component right here. So our goal is to first create an action creator that will fetch our given post. Let's open up our actions index.js file. And then inside of here, at the very bottom, we'll define a new action creator called export function fetch post. And we're going to assume that this function, this action creator, is going to be called with the ID of the post that we want to fetch. So we'll receive an ID, or receive an argument of ID. Then inside of here, we can form up an Axios GET request to reach out to our API and fetch the very particular post that we're interested in. At this point, I do want to remind you how the API works. If we make a request to API/post/5, we'll get back just that very particular blog post. So this is the type of route right here that we want to end up with. All right, so we'll say const request is going to be axios.get. We'll use a template string here, so do make sure that you're using backticks inside the URL. We'll start off with the root URL. Then we'll say /posts/ the ID of the post that we want to fetch, and then the API, curly braces, API key, like so. And of course, we want to make sure that we return an action from every one of our action creators. So we will return a type of fetch post with a payload of request. Let's not forget to create this type right here. So I'll scroll up to the top of the file. And we'll define export const fetch post, like so. Okay, so we've now got an action creator which should be able to reach out and find a very particular post from our backend server. Let's now flip on over to our reducer and make sure that we add in a case to catch this new type and add it to our application level state. So I'm going to open up my reducer post file. From the import statement at the top, we'll also import fetch post. And then we'll add on an additional case. So case fetch post. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit interesting. Now we know that our application or our post piece of state is an object. So we know that we're going to be ultimately returning an object here. Now we already have some number of posts possibly that have been fetched and stored inside this reducer. Now I really don't want to throw away all the different data that I've fetched over time. Really, I want to add to my existing application level state rather than tossing away all the previous posts that I've ever fetched. So to make sure that we take all the posts that we've already fetched and include them in here, we'll say ... state, like so. So take all the existing posts we have, take them all out of that state object and put them into this new object that we are about to return. And then on top of that, we're going to add a new key value pair where the key will be the ID of the post that we fetched and the value will be the actual post itself. So remember that the post that we fetch is available as action.payload.data because we're using Axios here, and the data that we care about is on the data property. So let's start off easy. We'll first say, here's the post. Here's the post that we're getting. Post is action.payload.data. Now we need to make sure that this object right here contains the ID of this post as a key. So we're going to do things first a very simple long form way that you might do if you were writing ES5, and then we're going to come back and refactor it to use a little bit of ES6. So I want to make sure that everything's clear to start, and then we'll do the fancy stuff after. So we'll say const new state. This is going to be the straightforward way. Then new state post.id is post. So take that new state object and clear up the comma there. Take the new state object and add on this additional property of the post ID and set that equal to the post, and then return new state. So if we only had ES5 available, this is the code that we would end up with. But with ES6, we can do something a little bit more clever. So I'm going to clean all this up. If you want to, you can comment this all out and refer back to it. Actually, I think I'll go ahead and comment it so we can refer back to it. So all we really need to put down here is return an object that is going to get all the state that we already had. Now here's the new piece of syntax. We're going to put on square brackets, I should say. Inside of it, we'll say action.payload.data.id, a colon, and then action.payload.data. Okay. So this code on this line right here, 100% identical, same exact thing as what we're doing in these 4 lines of code right here. By placing the square braces, we are not creating an array. Remember, we are not making an array right here. We are doing key interpolation. So we're saying whatever the variable action.payload.data.id is, make a new key on this object using this value right here, and then set its value equal to action.payload.data. So over time, as a user starts to fetch more show routes inside of our application, we'll fetch each of these additional posts and we'll add them into the overall state object right here. Okay, so in this section we put together our fetch post action creator, and we also added a little bit of logic to our reducer to meld that new post into our application level state. Let's take a break and then we'll continue in the next section and start working on making sure that the post show component will actually call that action creator. So I'll see you in just a second.